Rain fell on 17 miles of wounded men, 17 miles of wagons, packed axle to axle, groaning down a single muddy road in the dark, carrying soldiers who begged the drivers to just let them die where they lay instead of taking another jolt over the rocks. This was the price of losing at Gettysburg. And the man who gave the order to retreat wasn't hiding from that price. He rode straight into the middle of it. For 3 days in July of 1863, Robert E. Lee had thrown the Army of Northern Virginia against a hill it could not take. Now, with more than a third of his men dead, wounded, captured, or missing, he had to get what was left of that army back across a river that wasn't even at a fordable level. 40 miles stood between his broken lines and safety. Union cavalry was closing in from 3 directions, and somewhere in that chaos, Lee made a decision that almost nobody talks about, a decision that reveals more about who he actually was than anything that happened on the battlefield itself. This is the story of what Robert E. Lee did when his men were ordered to retreat 40 miles from Gettysburg. And it starts with a general who had just lost, walking out into the rain to face the men he'd failed. By the evening of July 3rd, the fighting was over, but the danger wasn't. Pickett's division had been shredded in the assault on Cemetery Ridge. Whole regiments came back as fragments of themselves. Officers who had led men up that slope that afternoon were now walking back down it alone. Lee met them at the base of Cemetery Ridge, and according to the men who were there, he did something almost no commander in his position would do. He rode toward the survivors, not away from them, and he told them the failure was his and his alone. Witnesses remembered him saying it again and again, taking every ounce of blame onto himself while soldiers wept in front of him. That moment gets remembered as an act of grace, but it was also the opening scene of a much colder problem. Grace doesn't move an army 40 miles through hostile territory with a swollen river blocking the only way home. Only decisions do. And within hours of that scene on Cemetery Ridge, Lee had to become a different kind of commander entirely, one whose choices in the days that followed have been debated by historians for over a century. Because what he did next either saved his army from annihilation or came within a hair's breadth of losing it completely. The math alone should terrify anyone who studies it. Lee's army had suffered something close to 28,000 casualties in 3 days. His ammunition trains were low. His artillery horses were exhausted. He was deep in enemy territory, in Pennsylvania, hundreds of miles from his supply base in Virginia, and the only army capable of reinforcing him was, for all practical purposes, non-existent. Meanwhile, George Meade's Army of the Potomac, bloodied but intact, sat just a few miles away, and Meade had the numbers, the position, and every reason to want to finish what Gettysburg had started. So on the 4th of July, while much of the country celebrated independence and Vicksburg fell to Grant 1,000 miles to the west, Lee began the hardest maneuver of his military career. Not a charge, not a flank attack, a withdrawal. And withdrawals, contrary to what most people assume, are often more dangerous than the battles that precede them, because an army in retreat is an army that has stopped being able to choose the terms of its own survival. Lee split his force into 2 columns for the march south. The wounded went first, in a wagon train that would eventually stretch for miles, guarded by cavalry under Imboden. The healthier troops, along with the reserve artillery and remaining supplies, took a shorter route through the mountains under Longstreet Hill and Ewell. It sounds simple laid out like that. It was anything but. Picture the wagon train. Ambulances were scarce, so ordinary supply wagons were pressed into service, hard wooden beds with no springs, carrying men with shattered legs, men with bullets still lodged near their spines, men whose bandages hadn't been changed in 2 days. The rain that began falling that night turned the roads into a churn of mud that swallowed wheels to the axle. Confederate surgeon and staff officer accounts from the march describe a procession of screaming that didn't stop for 17 miles, men in agony every time a wagon hit a rut, drivers unable to slow down because Union cavalry was rumored to be shadowing the column the entire way. This was the reality Lee had created with a single order, and he knew it. He rode the length of that column more than once. He wasn't managing the retreat from a map table in a tent somewhere behind the lines. He was out in it, in the rain, watching what his defeat had cost in human terms up close, mile after mile, in a way that most commanders in his position would have delegated to a subordinate and never witnessed directly. But sympathy wasn't going to get that army across the Potomac. And this is where the story turns into something much sharper than a tale of noble suffering. Because the river Lee needed to cross wasn't cooperating. The Potomac at Williamsport and Falling Waters was running high from recent rains, far too high to ford safely, and the pontoon bridge the Confederates had used to cross into Maryland weeks earlier had been destroyed by a Union cavalry raid while Lee was busy fighting at Gettysburg. So when the head of his army reached the river on the 6th and 7th of July, expecting a way home, they found nothing but fast, brown, uncrossable water. Lee's army was pinned with its back against a flooded river in enemy territory, while a Union force nearly twice its size gathered strength just a few days' march behind it. This is the moment that separates Gettysburg, the battle, from Gettysburg, the campaign, and it's the part almost nobody puts on screen. Because for 9 days, from around the 7th to the 14th of July, Lee's army sat trapped at Williamsport with no bridge, no reliable ford, and an enemy commander who for once actually had the chance to end the war in the Eastern Theater in a single stroke. What Lee did during those 9 days is the answer to the question this video's built around. He didn't panic. He didn't gamble everything on a desperate crossing. He dug in. He ordered his engineers and thousands of his own soldiers to build fortifications along a defensive arc, protecting the river crossing point, a line of trenches and breastworks strong enough to make any Union assault extraordinarily costly. At the same time, he had his cavalry and engineers work around the clock salvaging what they could to build a new bridge, tearing down warehouses in Williamsport for lumber, ferrying wounded and supplies across on whatever boats could be found. Lee had turned a trap into a fortress, and he did it while Meade, cautious after the bloodletting at Gettysburg and uncertain of Confederate strength, hesitated to attack. That hesitation has become one of the great what-ifs of the entire Civil War. President Lincoln, watching from Washington, was reportedly furious when he learned Lee's army had escaped across the river instead of being destroyed at the water's edge. He believed, and many historians since have agreed, that a decisive strike at Williamsport could have ended the war in the East that summer. Meade did eventually move to attack, arriving in force around the 12th and 13th of July. But by then, Lee's makeshift bridge was finished, the river had begun to recede just enough, and under cover of darkness and heavy rain, on the night of the 13th, the Confederate Army began crossing back into Virginia. The rearguard action that followed, at Falling Waters on the morning of the 14th, was the last violent gasp of the campaign. Union cavalry under Kilpatrick and Buford caught up to the tail end of Lee's retreating force before the crossing was complete. In the fighting that followed, Confederate Major General Henry Heth's division fought a desperate holding action, and Brigadier General J. Johnston Pettigrew, who had survived Pickett's charge only days earlier, was mortally wounded covering the retreat. He would die days later, one of the last casualties of a campaign that had already taken so many. But the army got across, nearly all of it. Lee had done what seemed almost impossible after the disaster of July 3rd. He had extracted a broken, exhausted force, with its wounded, its wagons, and most of its artillery, out of hostile territory across a flooded river, past a much larger enemy army, without losing the war then and there. Now here's where the story most people tell you stops. Lee got his men home. End of chapter. But that's not actually the most revealing part of what happened. The most revealing part is what Lee did with the blame. Almost immediately after the retreat was complete, word reached Lee of just how furious President Davis and the Confederate public were becoming about the defeat, and rumors began to swirl about who was truly responsible. Longstreet's delayed attack on the second day, Ewell's failure to seize the high ground on the first, Stuart's cavalry vanishing for days before the battle, leaving Lee blind to Union movements. There was no shortage of subordinates Lee could have pointed to, and given the culture of the Confederate officer corps at the time, doing so would have been entirely expected. He didn't do it. On August 8th, less than a month after crossing back into Virginia, Lee wrote directly to Jefferson Davis and offered his resignation. Not a partial apology, not a defense wrapped in blame for others. A full offer to step down, citing his own physical decline, and more pointedly, stating that the failure at Gettysburg was his responsibility, and that a fresher, more capable commander might serve the cause better. Davis refused the offer almost immediately, telling Lee that finding a more capable replacement was simply not possible. That letter is one of the most quietly extraordinary documents to come out of the entire war, because it runs completely against the grain of how military failure was usually handled on either side of that conflict. Commanders got sacked, commanders got investigated by hostile congressional committees, commanders blamed cavalry officers, blamed intelligence failures, blamed the ground, blamed the weather. Lee blamed himself twice, once in the mud at Seminary Ridge in front of his own retreating soldiers, and once in writing to the President of the Confederacy, when silence or a shifted narrative would have been far easier and far safer for his career. It's worth sitting with why that matters, because it's easy to flatten this into a simple story about humility. It wasn't only that. It was also, whether Lee intended it this way or not, an act that protected the Army's cohesion. An officer corps torn apart by public blame-shifting after Gettysburg would have entered the next campaign season fractured, suspicious of one another, weaker. By absorbing the failure himself, Lee kept Longstreet, Ewell, Hill, and Stuart all in their positions, all still trusted enough to lead their men, all still bound to an army that needed every ounce of unity it could hold on to if it was going to survive what came next. And what came next mattered enormously, because the Army of Northern Virginia did not simply fade away after Gettysburg. It fought on for nearly 2 more years. It won further engagements. It made Grant pay in blood for every mile of the Overland Campaign in 1864. None of that would have been possible if the retreat from Gettysburg had ended in disaster at the Potomac, and arguably, none of it would have unfolded the same way if the officer corps had spent the winter of 1863 tearing itself apart over who was to blame for the defeat. So when you ask what Robert E. Lee did when his men were ordered to retreat 40 miles from Gettysburg, the honest answer isn't a single action. It's a sequence of them, each one revealing something different about the man making the calls. He rode into the wreckage instead of away from it. He pushed a shattered, agonized column of wounded men through mud and rain for over 2 weeks, rather than abandon them to capture. He built a fortress out of desperation when the river refused to cooperate, buying time with earthworks instead of gambling everything on a doomed crossing. He got nearly his entire army across the Potomac under the nose of a larger, hesitant enemy force. And then, with the fighting over and the recriminations beginning, he took the blame that dozens of subordinates could have shared in writing to the one man who could have accepted his resignation and ended his command right there. None of this erases what Lee was fighting for, or the cause his army served, and the war he prolonged by holding that army together came at a staggering human cost that stretched on for nearly 2 more years. But as a case study in command under catastrophic pressure, the 11 days between Gettysburg and Falling Waters remain one of the most tightly wound sequences of decision-making in American military history. And almost none of it happened on a battlefield. It happened on a flooded riverbank, in a line of hastily dug trenches, and in the wording of a single letter that a defeated general almost didn't have to write. The battle at Gettysburg gets the monuments. The retreat is the part that actually tested him. Historians have spent generations arguing over whether Lee's decisions during those 11 days were the actions of a brilliant tactician managing catastrophe, or a commander who got extraordinarily fortunate that George Meade chose caution over aggression at the one moment it mattered most. Both readings can be true at the same time. Lee built the fortifications. Lee organized the bridge repair. Lee kept his army from dissolving into a panicked mob on a hostile riverbank. But it was also Meade's hesitation, driven by his own army's exhaustion and by uncertainty about Confederate strength behind those earthworks, that gave Lee the window he needed to finish the job. What's rarely disputed, though, is the discipline the Army of Northern Virginia showed during that stretch. An army that has just lost a third of its strength in 3 days of fighting is, by almost every historical example, an army at serious risk of collapsing into disorder during a retreat. Soldiers desert, discipline phrase. Wagon trains get abandoned in the mud when men decide their own survival matters more than the equipment they're hauling. That didn't happen here, not at scale. The wagon train made it, the artillery made it, the overwhelming majority of the infantry made it, and that outcome traces directly back to decisions made at the top, decisions about pace, about where to make a stand, about when to dig in and when to move. There's a detail from those 9 days at Williamsport that rarely makes it into the popular retelling of Gettysburg, and it deserves more attention than it gets. While his engineers scavenged lumber from the town to rebuild the bridge, and while his soldiers dug trench lines under intermittent rain, Lee reportedly worked alongside his staff late into the nights, reviewing reports from every corner of his defensive perimeter, adjusting troop placements as intelligence came in about Union cavalry movements probing his lines. This wasn't a general waiting passively for rescue or for the river to drop. It was a commander running an active defense against a numerically superior force while simultaneously conducting an engineering project under fire, with the survival of his entire army riding on both efforts succeeding at once. And when the crossing finally came, on the night of July 13th into the 14th, it happened in conditions that would have broken a less disciplined force entirely. Heavy rain, pitch darkness, a single pontoon bridge at falling waters, supplemented by a ford at Williamsport that was still dangerously high. Thousands of men, wagons, artillery pieces, and horses had to funnel across in sequence in the dark, while a rear guard held off Union cavalry that was actively probing for weaknesses. One mistake, one panicked stampede toward the crossing point, one collapsed section of that hastily rebuilt bridge, and the story of Gettysburg would have ended not with a defeated army going home to fight another 2 years, but with the effective destruction of the Confederacy's primary fighting force in the East, less than 2 weeks after the battle itself. It didn't happen. By the morning of the 14th, the Army of Northern Virginia stood on Virginia soil, battered, diminished, but intact as a fighting force, and Robert E. Lee had completed one of the most difficult withdrawals of the entire war. The cost of that withdrawal deserves to be named plainly, rather than folded quietly into the larger story. Along that road south, soldiers who couldn't survive the jolting wagon rides died before they ever reached Virginia. Local families along the retreat route in both Maryland and Pennsylvania found their homes and barns pressed into service as makeshift hospitals for men who would never leave them. Pettigrew's death at Falling Waters, days after surviving the catastrophic assault on Cemetery Ridge, stands as a small but telling reminder that the fighting didn't end when the retreat began. It simply changed shape. What makes this stretch of the campaign worth returning to generations later isn't nostalgia for the men who fought it. It's the far more uncomfortable question sitting underneath the story. What does a commander actually do in the moment when defeat has already happened and the only choices left are about how much worse it gets from here? Lee's answer, whatever you think of the cause he served, was to walk into the wreckage instead of retreating from responsibility for it, to keep moving when stopping meant capture, to build when the terrain refused to cooperate, and to own the failure in writing when silence would have cost him nothing. There's another angle to this story that rarely gets airtime, and it involves the man on the other side of that flooded river. George Meade had won the largest battle ever fought on American soil, and he'd done it only days after taking command of the Army of the Potomac, a promotion he received just 3 days before the fighting started. His own army was exhausted, its casualties nearly as severe as Lee's, its supply lines stretched thin from the forced marches that had brought it to Gettysburg in the first place. When word reached Washington that Lee's army had slipped across the Potomac intact, the reaction wasn't relief. It was fury. Lincoln reportedly told his Secretary of War that he could not understand it, that with Lee's army pinned against an unfordable river and Meade holding every advantage, the war might have been finished right there, and instead, the Confederates had been allowed to walk home. Meade offered his resignation over the criticism. Lincoln didn't accept it, But the wound from that missed opportunity never fully closed, and historians have spent more than a century picking apart exactly how much of the blame belongs to Meade's caution and how much belongs to Lee's skill at making an assault on those Williamsport earthworks look far costlier than it might actually have been. That's worth pausing on, because it reframes the entire retreat as something closer to a chess match played under unbearable pressure rather than a simple foot race to the river. Lee didn't just build trenches, he built the appearance of overwhelming strength behind those trenches, using his artillery reserves and the terrain itself to make a defensive line, manned by a battered, undersupplied army, look like a position no sane commander would throw men against. Confederate engineers picked ground with natural approaches that funneled any attacking force into narrow killing lanes. Whether Meade's Union scouts and cavalry accurately read that strength or simply assumed the worst after 3 days of slaughter at Gettysburg is still argued over, but the effect was the same either way. An enemy commander who had every reason to press his advantage chose instead to wait for reinforcements and better information, and that hesitation was the gap Lee needed. It's also worth remembering what this retreat looked like from inside the ranks, because the version told from headquarters tents leaves out almost everything that mattered to the men actually marching. Soldiers who had gone 3 days without real sleep were now expected to march through the night in driving rain, on roads turned to soup, carrying wounded comrades or dragging artillery pieces through mud, deep enough to trap a wagon wheel to the hub. Rations were scarce. Many units had been living off whatever they could forage from Pennsylvania farms since crossing into Union territory weeks earlier, and that source dried up fast once the retreat began, and the speed mattered more than supply discipline. Men who had marched north in June with full haversacks and confident talk of ending the war on northern soil were now marching south in July, hungry, soaked, and carrying the knowledge that the invasion had failed in the worst possible way. And yet accounts from soldiers who lived through it describe something that doesn't fit neatly into a story about a broken, defeated force. There was grim humor in some of the letters written home in the weeks after. There was fierce loyalty to the units they marched beside, an insistence among men in some regiments that they would rather die on that road than let their wounded fall into Union hands. There was also, running through nearly every account, a specific kind of attention paid to Lee himself, to the fact that soldiers kept seeing him along the column, not tucked away with the reserve, but out where the rain and mud were worst. That visibility did something for morale that no speech could have replicated. An army that has just been beaten wants to know its commander isn't hiding from what happened. Lee's continuous presence along that retreat route, from the wagon train to the riverbank to the trench lines at Williamsport, became its own kind of communication, wordless but unmistakable. None of this should be mistaken for a simple hero's narrative, and it's worth being direct about that. Lee was fighting to preserve a Confederacy built on slavery, and every mile of that retreat, every soldier who survived it, meant more months and eventually years of a war that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives before it ended. The skill involved in extracting that army from catastrophe doesn't erase the cause it served. But understanding exactly what happened during those 11 days, the specific choices, the specific pressures, the specific moments where the whole campaign could have ended in total disaster instead of a costly draw, tells you something true about command under the worst possible conditions, something that stays relevant regardless of which side of that war you're studying. By late July of 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia had settled back into camps in Virginia, rebuilding, refitting, absorbing replacements, preparing for a war that still had nearly 2 full years left to run. Lee's letter to Davis, offering his resignation, sat unanswered in the sense that Davis refused it outright, insisting there was no one else capable of holding that army together. Whether that was true is its own debate. What isn't debatable is that Lee remained in command, and the army he had pulled off that riverbank went on to fight at the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania, at Cold Harbor, campaigns that came within a hair's breadth of breaking the Union war effort's will to continue before finally ending at Appomattox in the spring of 1865. There's a reason this stretch of the campaign gets so little screen time compared to the 3 days of fighting that preceded it. Retreats don't photograph well. There's no dramatic charge to film, no single moment of clashing lines that sums up the stakes in one frame. What actually happened was slower and less cinematic. A general on horseback in the rain, checking on wagons, engineers tearing boards off warehouse walls to lash together a bridge, soldiers with shovels, digging for hours in wet clay because digging was the only thing standing between them and a Union assault they might not survive. None of it looks like the popular image of Civil War combat, and that's exactly why it tends to disappear from the story, even though it mattered just as much, arguably more, than what happened on Cemetery Ridge. Which means the 11 days between Gettysburg and Falling Waters didn't just save an army in the summer of 1863. They shaped the entire remaining trajectory of the war in the East. A collapse at the Potomac, a failed bridge, a panicked retreat gone wrong. Any one of those outcomes could have ended the fighting in Virginia more than a year and a half earlier than it actually did. Instead, an exhausted, bloodied army walked home across a river that wasn't supposed to let them through, led by a commander who spent those 11 days doing the least glamorous, least remembered, and arguably most consequential work of his entire career. 40 miles from Gettysburg to the Potomac doesn't sound like much on a map. It took 11 days, thousands of exhausted men, a flooded river, a destroyed bridge, and a general who chose to be present for every mile of it. That's what Robert E. Lee did when his men were ordered to retreat, and it's a story that changed how long a war already drowning in loss would go on to last.